there's no doubt about it, 2020 has been a tough year. Let's just call it a difficult journey. Because if we could call it a difficult journey through this rather tough year, I think we could use the difficult journey around the Christmas story as a way to find a message of hope in the midst of all of this. And that's my goal today. As we get ready to close out the year, we're still celebrating Christmas. Why don't we combine these two stories and see if we can find a way to face a new year that is going to continue some of the same issues, some of the same challenges, and if not a pandemic, there'll be something else along the way. You know, life is full of difficult journeys. Let's find some hope to give us some strength to face those difficult times together as people of faith. So take the story of Christmas. Everybody in the Christmas story was facing difficult circumstances as they were a part of what God was doing. You remember the shepherds out in the field? Yes, they heard the angel songs. We've been singing Christmas carols about the joy they felt and the song those angels brought ever since that day. What a great thing. What a wonderful moment it would have been to be a shepherd, right? I doubt you'd really like that. They were on the lowest end of the economic strata of their community. They lived in poverty their entire lives. And if you've ever lived in a situation where there simply wasn't enough money, you know how difficult, how stressful that stretch of life can be. That may be one of the challenges you faced over this last year. Certainly a lot of people have. And yet those shepherds were part of God's story. They had something to sing about because they were listening. They had ears to hear. And they were able to encourage Mary and Joseph. Now, Mary and Joseph, boy, did they have a difficult journey. I hope you've already checked out the 5-episode series we had on Finally Finding Christmas, because we followed Mary and Joseph from Nazareth down through the Jezreel Valley and the Jordan River Valley, and from Jericho all the way up to Jerusalem. What a difficult journey it was. It took at least 3, maybe even 4 days just to get from Nazareth to Jericho. If Mary was able to ride a donkey, certainly that wasn't very comfortable. And she was 9 months pregnant. Joseph worried about her the whole way. And then that last stretch, that horrible climb from Jericho up to Jerusalem and over south to Bethlehem, another 5 miles. It was just a difficult journey all along the way, putting one foot in front of the other. It's, again, little wonder that Mary was in a medical emergency by the time they reached Bethlehem. They would take any lodging available, even a shelter that was designed just to keep animals. And that's where Mary lay down and gave birth to Jesus in Bethlehem. And that brings me to Micah the prophet, who had a little piece of the story himself, because Micah is the prophet who had promised that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. But do you know Micah's story? He didn't have a life of ease. In fact, he knew a life of anxiety. The clue is right there in the first verse of Micah. It says Micah lived in a village called Moresheth. Now, find it on a map, and you'll see that Moresheth is halfway between Gath and Lachish. Those were the 2 large cities near Micah. He was about 6 miles from each city, about a 2-hour walk from each place. Gath was not a friendly place. Gath had been the home of Goliath, and it was still a Philistine city. Off and on, it had been under the control of David and Solomon, but then the other kings had lost it, and the Philistines were a problem again. They were kind of like a terroristic threat that constantly threatened Moresheth and Azekah and even Beit Shemesh. The Philistines were a problem. Micah did not feel comfortable living that close to Gath, I promise you. He and his family were under a constant threat. Now, the security they had would be to run to Lachish. Lachish was a fortified city at the southern part of the foothills called the Shephelah, and Lachish was heavily fortified by the kings in Jerusalem to protect Jerusalem. Any army coming up from the south, coming up from Egypt, would have to deal with Lachish. And even today, all of these centuries later, you can see the fortifications of Lachish and kind of sense its grandeur and the protection it offered. But here's the deal. Scholars have trouble dating Micah's ministry because as Micah talks about the trouble Lachish faced, the slaughter that Lachish faced, the bloodshed that was there, Scholars say, well, we don't know exactly which time he was talking about because over a 50-year stretch, Lachish was attacked 4 different times. And we do know the Assyrians completely decimated the place, and the carnage they left behind was legendary. It was just terrible. Now, that's the kind of stress that Micah faced in his life. The threat of constant of terror, of war, or the threat of war, the Assyrians making annual invasions in the northern kingdom, getting closer every day, and then eventually surrounding Micah's neighborhood. We don't know all that Micah faced. We just know he faced a lot of anxiety. And yet, in the midst of his stress, God spoke to him as if he were saying, I need you to give the people a message of hope. And he said, okay, I'll write it down. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come from me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. You know, by the time of the New Testament, people were so desperate for hope because they were under the thumb of the Romans. The thumb, it was a brutal kind of occupation filled with crucifixions and murder and bloodshed. The peace of Rome was a very violent peace. And they would look at a word like that from the prophet Micah, and they said, no, God's going to send the Messiah. God's going to send us a new king. David came from Bethlehem. God's going to send us a new king like David, even better than David. And he'll be a king for all time. He's what God has promised. Isaiah is another prophet who has a role in the Christmas story. Isaiah famously said that the virgin would be with child. Matthew also picked up on that phrase, knowing what Luke wrote about Mary's immaculate conception. Matthew says, well, look at what Isaiah said. Isaiah said that there will be a day when the virgin would conceive and bear a child, and his name would be Emmanuel. But again, do you know Isaiah's story and the stress points he faced? Isaiah's worries dealt with political change. Now, we have political change in our own culture and in different countries, in our country, and we have a way of government, you know, and sometimes we don't agree with the direction the government is leading us, but at least there's several different parts of the government, from judges to congressional bodies to different state leaders and local leaders, and finally there's a national leader, and all around the world it might be a prime minister, or it might even be a monarchy still. In ancient times, everything would rise and fall on the king. He was the prime minister, the president, the Congress, the Supreme Court. Man, he was everything. Whatever he said is the way things went. And so the character of the king determined the fortunes of the entire country. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem, and he was a prophet to the kings. He kept trying to bring them back to God's word. Now, when Isaiah started his ministry, Uzziah was king. Isaiah loved Uzziah, and he grieved when Uzziah died. Remember chapter 6, in the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. Well, there was a political change right there. Uzziah's son Jotham took over for a season. That wasn't very good. And then Ahaz took over, and that was just terrible. Ahaz goes down as one of the worst kings that Judah would ever know. And it started from the inside out. Yes, he made horrible economic decisions, political decisions, military decisions that nearly brought about the ruin of everything. But it all started with a spiritual absence in his own heart. And Ahaz trusted in anything that came along except the one true God. The God of his fathers, who had proved so faithful for so long, Ahaz simply couldn't bring himself to trust God. He trusted in every pagan religion that came along. He even moved the altar away from the temple, the one that had served so well for David and Solomon, and he moved it out of the way, and he brought in a pagan altar there, and he worshiped the sun god and the moon gods, and he had male prostitutes and female shrine prostitutes. It was so immoral, it's almost indescribable, even to the point that he would sacrifice his own children in the fire to a demonic god down in the valley of Ben Hinnom. Ahaz was completely bankrupt spiritually. Now, Isaiah was his prophet. Isaiah had the truth. Isaiah knew the truth. And Isaiah tried to get to Ahaz. He tried to tell him, Ahaz, just trust in God. In fact, there was a meeting early on, and maybe this is where that famous passage comes from in chapter 7. You can read the whole chapter for the proper context. But they met outside the city, and Ahaz was worried about his neighbors to the north. They weren't good neighbors. Israel and Aram had combined forces. They had a partnership together, a military partnership, and they were threatening Jerusalem. And Ahaz was trying to make a treaty with the Assyrians, and the Philistines were a problem. And Isaiah comes to him and says, stop for a moment. Ask the Lord for a sign. Give God a chance. And Ahaz very almost self-righteously says, I will not test the Lord. I won't ask him for a sign. And Isaiah lost his patience. And he says, well, therefore the Lord will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And he goes on in that particular prophecy to say, by the time a young woman can conceive and give birth, that's about 9 months, and then the child is weaned and can eat food on his own, your political problems, your military problems would be over, Ahaz, if you'll just trust God. That's the sign God is willing to give you. But Ahaz would not trust. And Ahaz made this horrible treaty with the Assyrians, and the Assyrians came in and took Aram, and then they took Israel, they took Samaria, they deported all of the northern kingdom. And yes, Ahaz, his immediate problem was over, but do you realize then he and the rest of Jerusalem woke up one morning and realized he had invited their version of Adolf Hitler to become their next door neighbor. And it wasn't long before the Assyrians circled around and took Lachish, and that would be Micah's stress point, and maybe he lived to see that. And then they came up through Azekah, and then they surrounded Jerusalem. And if it hadn't been for Hezekiah's incredible faith and Isaiah's prayers and the miracle that God gave, then Jerusalem would have been lost, Judah would have been lost, and yet it was all saved. God gave them the miracle, the deliverance from the Assyrians that Ahaz could have had if he had just shown the faith. Isaiah's stress point was just off the charts. From his vantage point, it had to look like his culture had lost its moral mind, that they had the wrong leader in place, and that everything was just going to fall apart. There seemed to be no hope for God's people. And yet, under the leadership of God's Spirit, Isaiah was able to write in the midst of all that stress that a virgin would be with child, that he would be called Emmanuel, and even beyond that, for unto us a child is born, a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. And the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. In his most stressful moments, Isaiah could see that God was still in control. And he was faithful enough to declare that word of hope to a people who felt like maybe there was no hope. And they clung to those words. And here we are, some 2,700 years later, still realizing how true those words are and how true they will be throughout all eternity. Isaiah's difficult journey, Micah's difficult journey, Mary and Joseph had a difficult journey, the shepherds had a difficult journey. Everyone involved with this story was dealing with stress points and anxieties and worries and physical pain and spiritual struggles and emotional struggles and maybe even isolation. And yet, God was in control the whole time. And Mary and Joseph finally made it to Bethlehem, and Jesus was born right where the prophet had said, and his name is Emmanuel, God with us. And by the time his life was over, people could see that so clearly that the world reset its calendar. I mean, it was such an important moment, this Christmas story event, that we just decided to say, somewhere back in history, we just decided to say, you know what? Everything before Bethlehem, we're going to call that before. And everything after Bethlehem, we're going to call that after. And so when we move the calendar to a new year, we're literally marking the number of years it's been since God kept his promise. And that baby was born in Bethlehem, the one called Emmanuel, God with us. He's a wonderful counselor, everlasting Prince of Peace, and of his government there will be no end. And my friend, that is a message of hope for you to hold on to right now. No matter how dark life gets, no matter what difficult journeys we face, whether it's in the next few hours, days, weeks, months, years, at some point in your life, it could get really, really difficult. You never let go of that truth that our God is in control and he will not leave you or forsake you. All he asks from you is to hold on to the faith and to keep walking in the journey he's given you. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Secrets from the Ancient Past. It's always an honor when you're here, and I hope you'll visit secretsfromtheancientpast.com and look at some of the other lessons we have. We certainly just finished up a Christmas series, but there's so many other lessons there, and I hope you'll take advantage of those and see how the land really does have secrets hidden in plain sight that can help us understand passages from the Bible so much more clearly. And we'll be back with a brand new year of lessons very shortly. I hope you'll join us then and share with others the word of Secrets from the Ancient Past. You can find us on any podcasting platform. I'm so glad you joined us today. I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. I'm Andy Cook.